Good evening, and we're really delighted to welcome you all to the launch of the Book Café. It's a new initiative of Login Gender, and the Login Gender portal of WISCOMP was actually launched in December 2018 as a hub where students, teachers, and policymakers from ATIs across the country could dialogue on issues at stake in the context of engendering higher education. And I think here Professor Mary John and Professor Meena Gopal have a vested interest in this space of higher education and also in investing it with the right kind of, if I want to, I'll use the term feminist, I won't say feminist Marxist yet, but feminist discourse. And this yielded a very rich palette of conversations, especially among students and some faculty, on what they considered serious gaps in the discourse. And increasingly, the talking and the writing began to invoke feminist scholars, and often not everyone was on the same page in terms of the concepts that were being used by some. So from there, the idea of the sharing around books that impact us in terms of the concepts that they yield to enrich our understanding about the many layers of the discourse, both ideationally and experientially, began to take root. And of course, this found resonance among a lot of young scholars, uh, younger students, and faculty. And I'm delighted to share that Anjali Bhatia has also been a contributor to this process. She wrote a couple of pieces, and that evoked a lot of interest. Um, so, with our young intern Akash Leena, ably initiated by Diksha Poddar, taking ownership to curate and navigate the process, the Book Cafe took shape. And so I'm delighted, we are delighted that the unanimous choice fell on women in the worlds of labor. And we're truly honored to have with us the iconic Mary John and Meena Gopal, who as the editors of the book bring an interdisciplinary and intersectional perspective to this whole issue. And they shatter several myths about the so-called feminization of labor idea and the neoliberal perspectives that abound and obfuscate the spectrum of challenges that diverse women in diverse workplaces face. And even as they continue to be obliterated, marginalized, indeed invisibilized, the women in the workspace, especially in the ways in which productive work is being fashioned, the idea of productive work, and, and understood by more and more people, and how an entire vocabulary that supports these myths is being churned out almost routinely through a very managerial, state-centered, and yet seemingly welfarist approach. So women in the worlds of labor cuts through the accepted jargon and reveals the inequitous, harsh underbelly of the worlds of work. And I remember, I think it was Martin Heidegger who had said, tell me what you read and I'll tell you who you are. And so he envisioned a kind of every reading as a dialogue with the text, which takes us from the seen to the unseen. And hopefully that is what will happen today as we hear this, this in this multi-vocal space. And I'm really delighted and honored that young scholars are here with us today. But before that, I must tell you a little bit about the chair, Dr. Anjali Bhatia. She teaches sociology and is the head of the Department of Sociology at Lady Shri Ram College. And along with her many scholarly engagements, like speaking at several international fora in Japan and the US, she works extensively on food, family, childhood, youth, and the middle class. The politics of food is a particular fascination for her. She writes on contemporary India, the middle class, courtship, and conjugality. And as you can see, as you will see, unconventional, creative, innovative are ideas that we associate with Anjali. She writes poetry and creative prose, and she's both provocative and evocative. So, and we are deeply grateful for Divya Goyer, who's a young scholar of development studies at Cambridge. In fact, she's just come in to the country today or yesterday. I'm not quite sure. And of course, Paridhi Gupta, postdoctoral fellow at the University of Zurich. And she's also the founder of Rewrite Academy. Paridhi, perhaps you will share with us a little more on what the Rewrite Academy does, because it seems to be doing very, very interesting stuff. And I think through your voices, several levels or layers of this book will speak to us in different voices. And I think that is part of the feminist project, this multi-vocality, if you want to call it that, in this pluriverse of ideas. So I will now request Anjali to take it away, and we look forward to a very riveting and engaging conversation. The experts will then comment on 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 your presentation, and Anjali will introduce the experts and the speakers. And if Akash Leena has any housekeeping announcements to make, perhaps this is the time to make them.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would just request all of you to please keep your videos on and mute yourselves so that we can all listen to and with each other and also see each other rather than just seeing icons. Thank you so much. I hope all of you participate and enjoy and learn from these conversations and reflections and ask as many questions as possible. Thank you. Thank you, Anjali, ma'am.
Okay, very good evening to all, and thank you so much, MG, WISCOMP, for showing me in the light of some purpose and relevance, and considering me for this doing. It's a privilege to be here, and having been a part of some of the fabled ritual of learning at WISCOMP, I can say that they are most rewarding, not in the least because these rituals gather around big ideas. They are evocative in letter and spirit, and transformative in intent. So today in the portals of WISCOMP's Book Café, standing ovation, we have a big idea in the book under discussion. Vignettes of Resistance, Engendering the World of Labor, and not to miss the subtitle, Interdisciplinary and Intersectional Perspectives. Co-edited by Professors Mary E. John and Meena Gopal. Greetings to both of you. Meena Gopal, apologies, and greetings to both of you. So to my mind, this book is off, and it belongs to the genre of lest we forget. Lest we forget there is a politics of knowledge. Lest we forget knowledge is gendered. And to my mind, this is the big idea. And the big idea is well met by practice. Specifically, the book draws our attention to this big idea, which is the politics of knowledge, in a long durée in context of the history of women's labor. I think it's a form of writing, and as a form of writing, in doing this, it resists the forces that push against the broadening of the history of the many worlds of women's labor. And as a form of contribution to knowledge, it intervenes as a response to what it calls a crisis of women's labor, which it analyzes through the lens of intersectionality and on the methodological grounds of interdisciplinarity. And to all the young people, researchers, and students who are here, I'd like to say that it's a great book if you want to learn how to write, though that is not the subject of the discussion as such, but to sort of how to argue your case, how to make a case, make sure that the reader never forgets. The reader never thinks that the issue has been resolved, that there has been a resolution to the problem. It's actually taken the proportion of the crisis. So what we have in today's program, it's going to be, it's a very important day, a very important book. And it's not for nothing that they say that wake up and smell the coffee, I think. Or reawake and smell the coffee. And I think that is what we are going to do today. We look forward to the presentations. We have two presenters, Dr. Paridhi Gupta and Divya Goyal. And we'll see how these presentations are basically engaging with the book under discussion, how these presentations are engaging with the themes that have been outlined in the book, some of the themes that have been touched upon in the book. So very important for all of us, as not just the big idea it is, but also as the doing. So the format is somewhat, it's very, it's not counterintuitive really. We'll invite speakers and they will make their presentation. And I think you have for about 10 minutes or 11 minutes for your presentation, the two speakers, after which we'll invite the professors to sort of step in and reflect on how the presentations really resonate with the book. And then we'll encourage everyone to speak fearlessly, and whatever is on your mind, engage. It's a great opportunity. We can't take these opportunities for granted, friends. So may I invite Dr. Paridhi Gupta, who is a postdoctoral fellow, University of Zurich, to set the ball rolling. And we are excited to hear you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for creating this amazing space. I've always been one who said that we need such spaces to come out of our silos and discuss with each other, create open spaces of discussion on academic texts, on academic worlds. We need to come out and get together and discuss it, especially right now in the pandemic. So thank you for doing this. And right off the bat, I would apologize because I have more questions today and more things to think along with you rather than a presentation or findings. So bear with me. It will all seem a bit jumbled up, but let's try and make sense of what I'm saying. Help me. So today, I will be iterating with you upon the ideas that I developed during my doctoral work, and which was on movements led by women and queer people, and the strategies they use within the protests. The work focused on the relation between physical spaces, gender, identity, and how they affect the movement space and the strategies people use. But during the process, while of course I was thinking about how to do this, I was also trying to understand the precarious position of activists themselves. But along with it, I was understanding, like I was face to face with my own precarious position as a woman researcher, and as a woman researcher who had a disability. How do I go into active movements? How do I research it? And where does my labor stand? And here I will draw some similarities between the labor of an activist and the labor of a researcher. They're not comparable, of course, completely different power positions, but both are undervalued forms of labor in today's society. And the marginalization in both increases for gendered bodies. both research and social movements are forms of labor which are underpaid or unpaid in case of activism. The book under discussion, which I may say is already a classic for me, is a beginning point for me to think about this work and to rethink with you all the very definition of work, or what we think as sites of labor, what we think as work. Like, have we ever thought of activism? We have, but just as a rhetoric, have we thought of activism and research as, as labor to be academically explored and open up? And the questions I'm wondering about is, how are social science research and social movements as sites of labor placed within the power hierarchies of our society, where both are seen with somewhat of a caution now? How does power work within these two systems itself, privileging few over others? And how is value assigned to these forms of labor? In case of involvement of gender bodies, in both the cases, the malleability of whom and the public as a site of both research and resistance places women as performing extra economic labor, as the book also suggests in some cases. In such a case, who are the women who can pursue both while also making sure of basic necessities of survival is a question that we must ask. This is where I believe the concept of intersectionality as an analytical tool, as an analytical method, can be thought of, as the book suggests. And here, I would like to think of intersectionality not as a stack of identities, as we have been often cautioned against, but as a crisscross of experiences that make our lives. I have to admit again that as a researcher, it has been difficult for me to employ this intersectionality as a tool, despite its ubiquity in academia. Because how does one capture the many experiences and locations of a person and that a person inhabits in their lives? And this is something that I'm still thinking about, and that I found it easier to use during my research to think of it as looking at a cross section of people's life, where you take a microscope and you focus it at a certain angle of a researcher's choice, and then open it up to study, where intersectionality becomes a site where often oppositional power dynamics of privilege and marginalization are at play in a person's life. Women researchers and activists experience the university and the protest site differently from their cis male counterparts due to their gender, but also the cross-hatching with other power dynamics of their identity. For an instance, in my study of the movement Pinjatore in Delhi, while the movement was against gender discriminatory rules, the strategies women students used, such as the night marches, became a way for women to resist not only the university-imposed rules, but the gendered experience of the city as well. As they were during their marches, they would go out at night, which was not allowed to many of them. While the movement did respond to the rights of some of the women to experience the university and the city space, it excluded concerns of many from marginalized religions and castes. These women rejected the organization for its upper caste Hindu Savarna character and showcased the exclusive nature of the seemingly inclusive and radical movement predicated upon system. Both participants experienced the protest space differently because of the differential experience of the university space itself and the fact that it was not addressed. Exclusion from university spaces and protest spaces existed therefore together for those who were marginalized. Furthermore, the organizational labor of women from marginalized religions and castes was ignored within the group, often using them as symbolic tokens and expecting them to undertake more work in the form of reading groups. For example, when they insisted that they felt exclusion as members of marginalized religions and castes, they were asked to run reading groups within the circle. And that meant that things that were of immediate concern to them, they had to go back and like explain through readings their own conditions to people who were more privileged than themselves. So, that's what the concern was, that it asked them to put in more labor while ignoring the labor they were already doing. And here I am centering the importance of acknowledging different forms of labor that people perform in similar spaces and how we respond to that can move their experiences from inclusion to exclusion, even in newer spaces, to combat the earlier exclusions that they were fighting. And since I have more time, like earlier I had prepped for like just 5 minutes, so now I have more time, so I can talk a bit about borrowing more from the book. The book also talks about paying attention to ethics of care. Now, ethics of care again has been and now an active site of research within movements as well. That how is care performed within movements. Uh, I'll state another instance. I also looked at the Shaheen Bagh movement and how care was established there amongst women was through practices of child caring for each other, from bringing in food from their homes for each other, for people they didn't know. But how the residents expressed care and experienced care within their space was very different from women who were coming from outside the space. For them, care was exchanging gifts, care was simply coming to that space. They were not often involved in the getting the food to the place or the organizational capacity. Those who were coming, even though they were coming every day, they were not involved in these aspects. So again, even though we're discussing care in both cases, how the labor and the amount of labor that goes into that care is very different. And it is very important, I feel, as researchers, to look at these differences, to acknowledge it, that not everyone within the same space is at the same plane. And marginalization and privilege are often pulling a person continuously when they're coming to protest sites. And as researchers, again, uh, we experience, gendered bodies experience a field very differently than cis men. The spaces we can go to, the times we can go to these spaces, the rapport we build is again very different. But it changes further when you're more disenfranchised, when you don't have the funds to take the taxi to the fieldwork, when you don't have the funds to go take the metro, or in my case, when your immunity, when you don't have the immunity, when you don't have the physical ability to go to these spaces. And then in academia, what is seen as valid labor, as labor enough to count as academically relevant. So these are important issues that I wanted to bring to light within my presentation. I can discuss it more in the later section, but I think I don't know if I have time. Also, Professor Gopinath talked about the Rewrite Academy. I would like to talk about it here. It's a peer support group that I created during the pandemic, and it follows from what I was saying earlier, that academia excludes so many who come from marginalized spaces. It assumes that people intuitively know how to write, that people intuitively know how to read, that people intuitively know how to be in conferences, how to apply to conferences, that people just know these things. And what we are saying for the group is that people don't, and people need to be trained. Our public universities often do not have the resources to do this, in all fairness. So while students in private universities get such access, students in public universities and those from marginalized communities don't. And so we began this peer support group where people come in from all over the world and share the skills they know. It's a non-hierarchical space where you can be an MA student or you can be a faculty. You're a peer and you're sharing the skills you know. We've had master students give workshops to faculty on building websites. We have faculty who have come in and talked about literature reviews, writing CVs. We have had that. And if anybody needs a support group, please join us with that. And that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paridhi. Would you like to just sort of talk a bit about your research interests? I thought I'd just request you to introduce yourselves also there.
Oh,
very
sorry.
quickly, yeah. And I mean, how does this sort of fit into, very quickly, just because that's something which would benefit all of us.
I primarily research social movements and social movements from the lens of gender, that how do different genders experience the protest space specifically. And my idea is to look, and I also, along with it, I also am now working on inclusive pedagogies. especially in universities, that how university spaces can be more inclusive. That's broadly my research. Within my doctoral work, one of the key things that I look at was visualizations, because the cultural manifestations of a protest, but through visuals. And those were a key part of the study. And that's another research area of mine, to look at forms such as public art, to look at forms such as poster making within the movement itself. That's my very broad focus area.
Thank you so much, Paridhi. There's a lot there in what you've said. So may I now invite Divya Goyal. Divya, are you here?
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you, Divya.
Yes, yes,
Divya, welcome. And would you like to sort of introduce yourself?
Sure. So I just completed my MPhil in development studies at University of Cambridge on a Commonwealth scholarship. And I'm primarily interested in the intersection of disability, poverty, and gender. I'm also interested in how context-specific and culturally sensitive approaches could be adopted towards disability, particularly in the global South.
Fascinating, thank you. Well, we look forward to your presentation. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So in this presentation, I'll particularly focus on the chapter titled Engendering Disability and Work by Renu Adlakha. Towards the second part of my presentation, I'll also discuss the recent inclusion of disabled workers under the National Employment Rural Guarantee Act and explore how state recognition, disability, and gender bear upon the reconstitution of work. So in this chapter, the author discusses how the incapacity to work is presumed to be a defining feature of disability and disabled people. This perceived incapacity to work often categorizes disabled people as constituting the non-laboring poor. It also classifies them as subjects of the welfare state. She draws our attention to structurally ableist conditions like neoliberal downsizing of the state and increased marketization and informalization that result in a disproportionately higher unemployment rate among disabled people. When in work, disabled people are often concentrated in low-paid, low-skill, and insecure occupations. A majority of them engage in self-employment activities without any form of social security. The author discusses how the right to work of disabled people is elusive across laws and policies. A major reason for this misrecognition is how an able normative standard is always applied to assess the capabilities of disabled people. They're always measured against an able-bodied norm. And it's interesting how this norm shifts and responds to different conditions. She also draws on the ethnographic fieldwork of Erb and Harris White in rural Tamil Nadu. In rural areas, no form of disability prevents people from working. They're engaged in various forms of paid and unpaid labor. Belonging to a certain caste as well as poverty forces people to work irrespective of the severity of their impairments. The author also brings our attention to how local concepts of disability evolve, which are very different to the Western idea of disability. For instance, in rural agrarian economies, people experience old age, chronic illnesses, and even pain as severely disabling because these conditions restrict their capacity to work and earn wages. This chapter raises some very important questions. I think the central question is that when the work of disabled people often remains unrecognized, where are disabled women located in this space? Disabled women are excluded from the sphere of productive employment. The unemployment rate among disabled women is much lower than that among disabled men. However, disabled women are also excluded from the domains of reproductive and care work, as they are perceived to be in need of care rather than able to provide care. Disabled women, however, are not exempted from domestic chores. They have to fulfill their domestic responsibilities irrespective of the severity of their disabilities. And it's interesting how disabled women have to experience a much higher degree of impairment to be exempted from these domestic roles and to be entitled to care and rehabilitation. The author brings our attention to how the gap in unemployment among disabled and non-disabled women is much smaller as compared to the gap between disabled and non-disabled men. This shows how gender becomes a defining feature in restricting the labor participation of disabled women and in invisibilizing their contributions. I would now move on to the recognition of disabled workers under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and the potential that this recognition has on reconstituting the meaning of work. Initially, disabled people were excluded from the definition of work. The definition of work that this act adopted was again, very, very able normative. In 2013, the government issued guidelines to include disabled workers under the category of vulnerable workers. So these guidelines stipulated that suitable works need to be identified corresponding to different abilities and be given to whoever applies. The government of Tamil Nadu in particular came up with this concept of effort-based payments. So they recognized that disabled people need to exert a higher amount of effort to get an equal amount of work done. So they said that disabled workers would be paid at the same rate even if they work for 50% of the time. This concept of effort-based payment and recognition of heterogeneous capabilities holds potential for an inclusive reconstitution of work. So a list of suitable works were identified for different disabilities. These works include distributing water to other workers, taking care of children of other workers, clerical and support related tasks, afforestation, etc. It's interesting how several of these works relate to unvalorized forms of labor relating to clerical and support roles. This distribution could hint at feminization of the disabled workforce, but could also imply recognition of clerical support and, most importantly, caring roles as integral to the functioning of this program. However, the way the program has been implemented, it's a very segregatory arrangement. Productive works are allocated to non-disabled people and unvalorized forms of work are residually allocated to disabled people. It has also been found that men with disabilities and people with less severe forms of disabilities are overrepresented in the workforce. So this whole discussion raises certain questions as to how do we reconstitute the meaning of work in a more inclusive way? How do we value less physically demanding forms of labor and bring support, caring, and caring roles under the purview of employment? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Divya. There's a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure there are, you've sensitized us to a world, really, I can only say this much. And it's worth our while to actually think about this world, and you've raised important questions regarding work, the definition of work, the scope of work, and the challenges therein. So Divya and Paridhi, both of you in your own ways, your papers, your presentations have raised very, very important issues. And I think now we should ask Professor Mary John to respond to the presentations, and followed by Professor Meena Gopal, and then we'll open the floor. And as far as the introductions go, I don't know how to introduce eminence. So
No, please don't. Please don't.
I wouldn't know. And yes,
Yes.
your work is your introduction. And thank you so much for doing what you do.
Thank you. I'm really amazed that WISCOMP, and grateful that WISCOMP chose our volume, which, as we said at the very beginning, has been a labor of love. And as we know, labors of love, sometimes the love part gets rather stretched. It took all of 7 years from the time when we organized the conference, which was in 2014 at TIS, which was very marvelously organized by Meena Gopal and her team and students there. It was a collaboration between the Center for Women's Development Studies and the Tata Institute. And from there, it sort of had a rather bumpy journey, I should say, to its final, appearance last year. So it's really gratifying to see that, when we've done it all, it seems to have, there are people at the other end who want to read it as well. So really, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for these marvelous presentations. I can't think of a better way to, how shall I say, acknowledge what it is we're trying to do with our volume than to hear these kinds of presentations. I mean, I think, in fact, even though it has all of 20 plus, contributors and all of that, we are just scratching the surface here when it comes to all these issues that need to be counted, need to be acknowledged within, and we've used the word, the pluralization of worlds of labor, which is, of course, a lazy thing to do. We are living in one world, more or less. But we were caught in this kind of, I could say, a kind of cleft stick of, on the one hand, having to painfully acknowledge the extreme declines and marginalization of employment, decent work for pay in a country like ours. We are somewhere near the very bottom of the global scale when it comes to employment rates for women. That is to say, forms of work that are acknowledged through the market in some fashion, market or state, whichever. We are somewhere near the very bottom. Not only that, we have managed to get even worse over time, which I think is a very remarkable feat, when the rest of the world has undergone dubious, no doubt, forms of feminization, where the women worker can be a preferred worker in many, many areas. This has been a very common story of globalization. Very little of that has been visible in our case. So what is this situation within which then we want to place on record the extraordinary myriad ways in which women have nonetheless and are always, in a sense, working, whether for recognition or not, The most obvious, of course, being the sphere of the domestic, but it extends into many, many more areas. And I thought that way Paridhi's presentation was really interesting because it threw light on the student as a worker. Teachers are always complaining about all the work they do, but in the university, and we have staff in universities, but what about the student? Are all students working, including when they're in the classroom? This is a very interesting question. When they do their assignments and so on, what about the student researcher? What is their status, male or female, or any gender for that matter? It's a very interesting question, I think, because usually the student is thought of as being in training, as being an apprentice for, and the PhD is that big apprenticeship for the future of a profession within the university structure or something similar, a research structure. So apprenticeships are not thought of as productive and labor valorizing. So very interesting question there. And the other question, of course, about the organizer as well as the participant in a protest movement. What is their labor and what gets acknowledged, and what does it get acknowledged as labor in the first place? Is the organizer, is the speaker and a worker, as distinct from some other kind of description that they might use, and the many things that you raised, and within that the heterogeneity of that in terms of organizers and participants, as in say Shaheen Bagh or some of your other examples of marches in our cities on March 8th that happen, but as we all know, require enormous amounts of organizational work. How do we? I know that it's very interesting that some parties, when they bring women to a march, left parties, some of them actually do, because many of these women are going to lose a day's wage, actually then pay the women in compensation for the wage lost when they actually come to a march. And I found that a very, very interesting concept, which we might otherwise miss completely when we think of protests that we attend, quote unquote, voluntarily. And so the whole dimension of what is voluntary and what we do out of political conviction is, as we know, completely a slippery slope here when it comes especially to women. And Divya, I wish I've retired from CWDS. Otherwise, I would have told my colleague Renu. She couldn't have found a warmer person to actually acknowledge her work. She works in the field of disability, and you have raised all those kinds of. These are complex, contradictory questions. They don't fit any one box. I think that's the other important thing to remember, that on one hand, you'll be marginalized, you'll be thought of as incapable of work. And on the other hand, any number of duties will be heaped on you at this very same time as being expected from you, even as a person with disability. Very interesting to hear about the Narega effort in Tamil Nadu and what that might or might not do. And as you have pointed out, a contradictory enterprise that on the one hand, I like the idea of suitable work. We have the term decent work from the ILO, but you have given us the term suitable work. What does that make possible? At the same time, as you pointed out, there seems to be segregation nonetheless within this inclusive moment. We nonetheless have segregation, as is such a common kind of strategy. I'll stop there and invite Meena to add her words. Thank you. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you, colleagues at WISCOMP, Meenakshi, Anjali, and Akashlina, and thanks, Mary. And a very warm appreciation to both Paridhi and Divya for really bringing some of the issues that the book tried to raise, all the authors, in a very, very enlightening fashion. I'm so delighted with that. Because one of the most important things that the book tried to break was the bounds of disciplinarity. That is, we had people from multidisciplinary locations coming and engaging with the question of women's labor and the crisis that it is generating. and at the same time break the binary of this activist academic. And I think Paridhi's presentation really brought that out brilliantly, where how do you accommodate identities and experiences, that you brought it out wonderfully. And how does you look at a researcher who can be an activist also, but an activist who also generates a whole lot of knowledge, and looking at this as labor. So I think that's one important issue that you've highlighted in your presentation. And also the other thing that the book tries to bring it, and both Divya and Paridhi brought it out well, is to bring in the intersection of, say a question like stigma around whether it be caste, or whether it be sex work, or whether it be disability, something like that, how it's highlighted. And so using these examples and concepts to push the norm, I mean, as we keep exploring new dimensions of labor, new experiences of labor, how do you push the norm? And that's, I think, both of you flagged it quite well. And I think that was one of the things that the book also tried to bring out. And it's heartening to know that that exploration is ongoing. And then, of course, as Meenakshi said in the beginning, that this is a resource for students. And so, being located at TISS, this is something that I feel very gratified about, and a lot of acknowledgement that students can engage with it and also keep pushing the boundaries. For instance, some of the things that we did not address are the locations in the gig economy, or, what happens to those who labor in, say, in the meat industry. I mean, there's so many things that are sort of not addressed yet, but have the scope for exploration. So that's one. And opening up new spaces and discussion and inclusion in that well. And say, for instance, migration being a very important issue, what methodologies can you use to capture that experience of women specifically? And in this, I think I'll just echo Mary by saying, what Divya spoke about, this unvalorized work. It's really invisible, it's unacknowledged, but I mean, it's also not valorized in that sense. So how do you bring value to that? I think that's really a very important thing that you raised. And finally, what the book also generates, you see that the essays are speaking to each other. So there's an ongoing conversation that's there. And whether it's the first part, which deals with a lot of history, but later the ethnographies, and finally the whole organizing effort. So resistance of people keep, making the conversations alive. And I think this forum that WISCOMP has, I think this forum that WISCOMP has brought in has also, engendered that conversation. So thank you again for this opportunity, and I think we can have more discussion.
Thank you, Professors Mary John and Meena Gopal. Well, the floor is open. There are young people here, several. I think a world has been opened. It is opening before us. And we thought there is this one world, it's an ontologically, one is so destabilized when you realize that there are so many worlds there, and depending on one's location, identity, you experience these worlds very, very differently. There are so many sort of axes that are cutting across, and we are trying to sort of balance so many axes. So may I now invite people to sort of respond to the issues. I think it'll take us some time, because at one level, these are very everyday things. So it's the great thing is that we have already sort of put our finger on some things. And I think once you do that, the rest of it is easier. So I think we put a finger on several things. Did we think of care as something that needs thinking in this fashion? Did we think of a simple studentship as meriting these sort of questions? So please sort of, may I invite you to reflect, think aloud also to begin with, so that there is some kind of a takeaway. I mean, what should be our takeaway? And that takeaway is going to be a return gift to the labors of the two professors here who put together this book. And a sort of a thank you to WISCOMP also, with the reason why we are here. So please.
Yes. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would request all of you to raise to use the option of raising hands, which is there in the bottom panel in the Zoom taskbar. If when you raise your hands, we'll call you out and we'll unmute you, and then you can ask your questions. Also, can we request you to also keep your questions, reflections, stay out loud, anything you feel free to share, to keep it under a minute, and also just state if it's specific to some speaker. I would also request all of you to please feel free and feel that this is your space to switch on your cameras and ask these questions, because as Anjali ma'am also said, we do not get these spaces, and we're really privileged to have both the co-editors with us. We're honored to have Paridhi and Divya with us. And please feel free to raise any sort of question you have, anything you wish to think aloud, and please just feel that this is your space. I think we already have someone who's raised her hand. So can I request Kadambari to pose your question, whatever is your reflection?
Yeah, am I audible? Okay. Hi, so I'm a PhD research scholar at Sociology, and I am continuing building on my previous work during MPhil on the issues in the lives of sex workers. And my current focus is space and sexual pleasure. But the spatial aspect is the major focus. And when this book came out, I bought it. I bought it as soon as it came out, and I have never enjoyed reading an academic book as much as I've been enjoying reading this one. So thank you to both Dr. Meena Gopal and Dr. Mary John for this book. And um, Swati Shah, I think, has already thanked you for asking the question in the chapter on how did the concept of sex for work emerge. And I was going through it, and I felt it so well. The answer as well so well articulates my own field observations during my previous work, as well as I mean, they are recurring observations, that are made in that answer. And it has been articulated so well, and it is so usable for a researcher like me, and it helps us to push the thought forward, because a lot of times we are struggling with the sheer articulation of these complex expressions of someone's experiences, so thank you very much for the question and everything. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, thank you so much, Kadambari. Can I request Professor Mary John, Professor Meena Gopal to probably even respond? Otherwise, we could also move on to, I can see ma'am's hand up as well. So I would
why
then
don't we move
request.
on? Thank you, Kadambari. I have to say, you even held up the book. And as Meena has, I will say this, it's a book published in the world of publications, which means it has a price, it's available online and in bookshops. But yes, I endorse Meena's what she has said in the chat box. It can be downloaded also. And that definitely students and so on, we and let me say, I'm a retired person, we do it all the time.
May I come in, Kashlina? First
Ma'am,
of all,
please.
I've been sort of it's been so inspirational to listen to the two presentations, and also, of course, to have Mary and Meena with us. I had a question before I make a comment, and my question is really to both the professors. There is a state of discrimination report that came out in July 2022. I'm sure you are all aware of it. And there is an allusion or reference to state policies that reinforce discrimination while appearing to be supportive of women. For example, women who are kept outside of what are known as jobs that are hazardous jobs, that leaves out a whole chunk of women from the workforce. And it could be as simple as even serving liquor, for example, and from Kerala, most of the liquor hubs are run by women, many of them, and successfully. Now, by doing this, the so-called welfareism on the one hand, the care for women's safety on the one hand, and actually keeping them out. For example, not being they're not supposed to be employed after 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. in shops. Now, how does this then work to further keep women, to legitimize keeping women outside of the workforce? And I just like your comments on that. And two comments to both Paridhi and Divya. Both of you mentioned or at least alluded to the ethics of care. And you also mentioned non-hierarchical spaces. Now, do you see, in the context of women's protest movements or even the assertion of the rights of people with women with disability, do you see this playing itself out positively, consciously? Or is it just by virtue of the fact, and I hate to use this old time-worn kind of socialization idea, but is it because we are socialized into particular kind of roles that we tend to work in a non-hierarchical way more easily than men do? And my last comment, and here I would like to draw my colleague Seema Kakran into this discussion. WISCOMP had done a little report on engendering the higher education space. And that was based on several interviews and workshops that we had at different HEIs. And one of the exercises we carried out was to find out from women teachers how they perceived which aspect of the day they did productive work and so-called unproductive work. Okay, and the results were sort of really shattering to it would be shattering to any feminist, right? Now I would just like, and there's a concept there, and it's developed quite significantly in France, called time poverty, and how women negotiate this time poverty. And I'd really like Seema to weigh in on that, to sort of bring in that perspective as well. Thank you so much. Thank you. And this book is a great contribution, to so many of us who are struggling for the concepts, the words, how to enter the space, because there are so many different dimensions to it. And I loved, Paridhi, your re-articulation of intersectionality, I must say. Because intersectionality is now kind of used almost as a sort of a rote term by people to mean, what. So this was an interesting take on it, and I'm sure Mary will have something to say on that. Thank you so much. Thank you, really.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Can I request maybe Tima ma'am to come in and speak a bit about time poverty, or do we move on to the next question? Whatever works, ma'am.
If Mary and Meena could respond to that.
Meena, why don't you go ahead, given time? And I see there's somebody else with a question. So,
yeah. So basically, I think it is a problem. I mean, the state itself obviously discriminates. I mean, in this, I can just draw an example, although I haven't looked at the details of the report that you mentioned. But an example, I can say how, in 2005, the Maharashtra government banned women who danced in bars, saying that they were, being exploited. And of course, there was a whole lot of feminist debate around it. But in a way, the state was taking away women's self-sought livelihoods. That's how women would like to see it. We chose those jobs ourselves. Nobody gave those jobs to us, and yet we are being discriminated because of a state action. So rather the women preferred that legislation be enacted, like for instance the Matadi Workers Act, the Head Loaders Act, where they get protection. And also in the workplace, if you think there is exploitation, then let us have committees for sexual harassment. So let there be action for prevention of sexual harassment. So rather than bringing protective measures such that a ban or depriving people of their livelihood is not a solution, is what that study and feminist engagements around that taught us.
Professor
There's
John, would you like to say? Yeah.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat box. I think there's Devika Mishra has also raised her hand, so I don't want to, but there was a question in the chat box by Siddhi Lodha saying, we talk about work-life balance. Is it more about a tightrope or tightrope walk between work and household work? I have to say that I am not a fan of the term work-life balance. I'm not sure that it actually captures enough of the gendered nature of the life that we live. In fact, time poverty, if anything, captures it much better. I mean, there's overwork at every level. It's not that life is not work. I mean, perhaps for certain kinds of persons, the idea that there is a certain amount of hours of work and then there's a certain time when it's life, understood perhaps as leisure, or I don't know how it's understood outside of work. It's a term that I think emerged some time back in sociology in the US, and I don't want to sort of denigrate it, but I really, and least of all do I think it captures the actual daily life of many women in our country. And I'm thinking perhaps of Meena's work on BD workers. You cannot imagine a life where work and life are completely entangled with each other. What is this balance that a BD worker is supposed to attain? Is that where the problem, is that naming the problem? I really have a doubt here. And it's not a tightrope. It's actually exploitation and lack of valorization in almost all worlds, with some, of course, important exceptions. Some of us in public universities and in other kinds of public sectors do enjoy equal pay and so on for the official work we put in. But even there, I think if you were to look a little more closely, we might see a lot of fissures along a range of class and caste and gendered lines. So who does what and at what time and in what ways, and who's assumed to be free at what hours and so on. I think all of that would need to be disaggregated. So sorry if I don't seem to be a fan of the concept of work-life balance. But I think if Meena wants to add to that, or Devika Mishra has her hand up.
Yeah, then can I request Devika to come in? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so sorry if there's little time, and me just raising this point is taking up into kind of elaborating more on these very interesting questions. But this is something that I just wanted to kind of talk to Paridhi about, who was talking about very interesting ideas about activism and academic activism. And I had just 2 points, that when we talk about this hyphenated academic activist space, which I think one of the professors was also problematizing. So firstly, how do you, if you just talk about both concepts as separates, the activist in the non-academic space and the academic in a non-activist space trying to interact. So the one problem I see is how does the very act of producing academia, the language of academia, how does that sort of really create this hierarchy, who gets to do the activism, who gets to participate in the activism and then write about it. And secondly, more importantly for people like me, I didn't introduce myself. So I've just finished my PhD. I'm an assistant professor at OP Jindal. I teach IR. The second question, which for people like me who are newer into the university space as people who have power, is that how does the academy continue to sanitize and control us in our activism? How do you really sort of negotiate that very difficult hyphenated space when there's increasing control of what you can produce, your gender problematizes of what you should be producing, and that space of privilege and marginalization that Paridhi was talking about, how does that sort of interact with the identities that you want to start building on, which you could hopefully one day come to occupy with your work? And I say occupy very, very forcefully. So I don't know if there are any thoughts on this, but I just felt that this was something important to bring up because it resonates. I work on Latin America, and it resonated with some discussions I'd heard about from Brazilian activist women talking about how their sisters in academia always seem to exclude them. How can they not know? How can they be deemed not academic enough when it is their lived experiences and their terminology that's being co-opted by the academy? And again, thank you so much to both the presenters and both the editors. It was really interesting.
Can I actually thank you for the question and reflection, Devika? Can I actually request Seema to actually come in and share her reflections, because I feel what even ma'am pointed out, if Seema would come in.
I'm sorry, thank you so much for those really wonderful presentations, and thank you, Professor Mary-John and Meena Gopal. I mean, I have so many questions and so many things that are churning in my head, but I'll quickly try and share what Dr. Gopinath was talking about, the discussions that happened at several universities and how the academic work, the professors themselves, the faculty themselves, what part of their work they see as productive and what part of their work they see as, quote unquote, unproductive. So a lot of them talked about how much of their time just goes away in mentoring students. So my students have problems and they come up to me and take up a lot of my time, that kind of work, besides the care responsibilities and domestic work that we know, the unpaid work that women have to do, and how much of their mind space, even when they are on campus, how much of their time is taken up by things that they have to do because of their domestic responsibility, and how that compromises how many research papers they are able to churn, how many conferences they are able to attend, which become yardsticks for career enhancement and their reaching, the professorial or higher decision-making levels. And then multiple other layers of how men have their own informal ways of making crucial decisions within the university spaces where women obviously do not have entry. So that was one thing. I also wanted to bring up one other thing, with your permission, just very quickly, that while doing this work, and Professor Mary-John, you pointed out how the sociologists in the US came up with this idea of work-life balance. And so while looking at that literature also, one was struck by how the student's work and the work that the student does is seen. So theoretically, they said, okay, if you are being paid and if you are a student who's on a scholarship, then the work that you do is paid work. But if the same work you are doing but are not being paid for it is unproductive, quote unquote, unproductive work. And so one really didn't know how to understand this categorization of paid and unpaid work. And I would like to ask you, is it because Professor Mary-John and Professor Meena Gopal, is it because of the aversion to using the Marxian terminology in the West, where they don't really want to use the term alienation, or they don't want to really opt into that kind of vocabulary, that they are stuck with this, where they don't want to acknowledge that, to separate these two into, it's a conundrum that there's no way out. to come out of. And just one half a minute, if I have also on Divya's presentation. I mean, wonderful, all of the multiple layers, Divya, that you have unearthed and, opened up for us on how women with disability and their work is understood, and the misconceptions. I mean, the whole idea of looking at persons with disabilities as exceptions, a minuscule minority, and all of that, which comes with a whole lot of paternalism when you direct policies towards this minuscule minority who is looked down upon in certain ways, stigmatized. I mean, one is just, Narega is one thing. I mean, I'm just appalled at the way national award for the best employee, disabled employee, how it's framed. I mean, I would urge the researchers to go look at the description of some of these things in the so-called more enlightened policy space. I mean, there are so many layers. Thank you so much for the time that you've given to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we are probably falling really short on time, but I am going to request Anjali ma'am to come in for a quick comment, maybe, because she did have, I know she has a lot probably to say as well, but if we could have a quick comment.
Thank you, Akashlina. It is just thinking aloud, because I said now just let there be free association. Professor Gopal is here. Shabash Mithu is around. And so there is a sense in which we understand the world of work. But I'm thinking about, in terms of emotional labor, women's emotional labor, women's sexual labor, is, for instance, the arena of sport today, is it immune to, women's emotional labor? I mean, is a sportswoman a sports person?
You're asking me to respond to.
I'm just saying, because you see, I'm just saying the question of emotional labor of women and sexual labor of women. Can I just be me, a person? How do I sort of extricate myself from, and I'm thinking about the arena of sport now, because that is the new, arena of nationalism in a way. And so how do we sort of, what is the articulation between, let us say, normative ideas about, normative patriarchal ideas, and how it is going to reflect in the arena of sport? Because a lot is being sort of, I think that is a new area. We need a new space to watch.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense, if the domain of sport is actually starts with play, leisure, understanding oneself and the body. I mean, these are spaces where all of these come into play, and we assume that there should not be any gendering, but because we live in a gendered world, of course, there will be gendering, the notion of the private and the public, and who has access to the public and the private, who has access to opportunities, etc. So obviously, all intersections of gender, race, caste, class, all of that are going to play even in the realm of sport. I mean, that's what I have to say, and we hope everybody can be a sports person and in their own right participate. But we know that we live in a, as you said, sport is also an industry, and it's a part of sports markets, and there's sports cultures. So all of these domains, have all of these aspects, and that's going to affect the person who's also engaged in it.
Thank you, Akashli.
Thank you so much. Professor Meena Gopal, would you like to also share some, maybe could we have some final comments and reflections from all the speakers and all the professors? Also, just to come here, I would there would definitely be a lot of questions and we wouldn't be able to take because of the paucity of time. I'm going to request all of you to please write to us. And in fact, as ma'am also mentioned in the beginning, we do have a login gender portal too. So can I also request you to log into that portal and share your reflections, conversations, and we could even request both professors to maybe also share their comments ahead. And we hope to take this conversation ahead. But before that, I'm just going to request all of you for maybe some final words.
Yeah. No, I'll just
could we ask Mary to respond to Vanshika Singh's long question in the chat box?
Yes, yes. I'm not quite sure how to answer it because it perhaps is a misunderstanding. I use the term slippery slope in not in connection to any protest movements, but in the context of voluntarism. Women are caught in a deep vice when it comes to what we do because we somehow voluntarily do so. And this is not simply about the home, which is a very well, I think, articulated, but community work, a whole range of other labors. The Anganwadi workers have been called voluntary workers and have never been paid a wage. Even to this day, I think it's still called an honorarium, even if the amount has been raised. I was referring to that slippery slope. I don't think I have anything to say about the rest of the question because I'm not sure that I understand it, and maybe it's not, quite. I don't know what is an authentic or an inauthentic protest movement. I think there are authentic, inauthentic of anything. So I'm not sure that protest movements need to be specially categorized in any one way. I think the question that Paridhi raised was of deeply motivated, deeply authentic forms of protest movements that nonetheless go where the work that goes and the labor required to make a protest movement happen go unacknowledged and or are very differentially acknowledged as to whose labor becomes visible and whose does not. I think that's what I would like to say. Otherwise, I don't really, there's no final word here. I really think that what you have done is open up dimensions that are even, going beyond the work and that I think is in the full spirit of our volume, which is to push the boundaries. On the one hand, I think we should acknowledge our forebearers. It is women in the women's movement and in women's studies who in the 1960s and 70s in our context first actually pushed and actually made some very, very, very important, they raised the question of women's labor in a way that it had not actually before and had to be raised, and I'll say this, had to be raised in contrast to first world boards in which a certain, let me just call it that, a liberal feminist mode of thinking about the public-private. I think it was from our spaces, the third world spaces, that an amazing generation of mainly women, also men, okay? I mean, also economists, who should not be forgotten, including Amartya Sen and figures like that, who actually asked us to look at women's work and the status of women and we don't even have full answers yet to these. Are debates that continue, but we owe it to them that they opened it up the way they did a long while ago. And I think there's a new moment today when thankfully it appears that we are gaining a little more traction than we used to. And this is a discussion also that I have with myself and with colleagues and fellow feminists and so on, where violence, and I think Meenakshi would know this very well, we have looked at violence and looked at gender-based violence as central to women and their oppression. And my only disquiet, if you like, was that seemed to saturate the kind of public discourse and acknowledgements. So even disabled persons as being recipients of violence, but disabled persons as being fully engaged in productive work is not on our agenda. So I think our volume has attempted to just make that more credible, I think, for people to think with and to take forward. So thanks WISCOMP, thanks Meenakshi and all of you for a wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Would Paridhi, Divya want to share something before we could also come in for a vote of thanks and closing comment?
Yes, I might respond to the question that was asked for me about the activist researcher difference. Again, in my presentation also, I've sort of critiqued that I am also critiquing the act of extractive knowledge or co-opting movements. The researcher cannot, the activist researcher also cannot just go into the movement and take up knowledge of people and claim it as their own. And a strategy to use it is to involve that ethics of care within our research practices and within our writing practices, where we are not even not only just giving due credit in forms of acknowledgement, but also writing for the people who we are researching, writing with the people we are researching. Send in your drafts to them, involve them in your writing process. That will make us less isolated in writing, perhaps, and researching, perhaps. So that's one of the things that I would like to say. And once again, thank you, Professor John. Thank you, Professor Gopal, for this amazing, amazing work. It was a delight to read, and it was much needed. So thank you for it.
Thanks very much.
Divya, would you like to say something?
Thank you so much to Professor John and Professor Gopal for this wonderful volume. And I'm extremely grateful to WISCOMP for this platform and all the reflections that came in. It certainly raises very important questions. And I also thought about different kinds of work that often doesn't get acknowledged. I think one of the things that stood out to me is how in case of disabled people, the work that goes into navigating spaces that aren't designed for disabled people is never acknowledged as work. So yeah, thank you so much for all the reflections and questions.
Thank you so much, especially to Professor Meena Gopal and Professor Meena Gopal. I think it was. I don't think I had any doubt in like even asking that we have this book as our just opens up worlds for us, worlds of questions, worlds of reflections. There's actually so much to take away. And I would have wanted some more time on maybe intersectionality, because just as Paridhi said, it's not a stack of identities. Then we had Divya coming in with the question of able-bodied, who really qualifies as a worker? What are these normative practices, discourses, institutions that we have also normalized to a certain extent? Thank you for reminding us to also be very careful with our normative understandings of work, worker, again, worlds of labor. Even though ma'am said that it's a lazy choice, I would say the point about worlds of labor made me think a lot. Is it home? Is it workplace? What are these sites we are talking about in terms of worlds of labor? And I would also say something. When we had the book cafe, I'm sure everybody had their own set of takeaways, because we discussed so much. We didn't have one or two learning outcomes. I believe we discussed a plethora of issues, from able-bodied, gender-bodied, to even sports. And I think this is what is about the ethos, which I think we would like to cultivate in terms of the book cafe, that this is a space for everyone to come in, to think out aloud, and just share their ideas and insights. It does not have to be in the form of a research paper. And as Paridhi actually pointed out, a lot of us maybe are not yet trained to write in that way. And yet it's also for students to, keep on articulating and thinking about these things. So I'm sorry, I've probably taken a lot of time, but I would definitely extend my thanks to all the speakers for your insights. I have to thank the WISCOMP and FUR team, Mr. Mehrotra, Dr. Gopinath, for giving us this space, for actually letting us experiment with something so different. And I hope we have many more conversations. I hope we have many more reflections coming in. Tima Ma'am, Shilpi, Diksha, without them, none of this would have been possible. I really do hope, do check out our Login Gender portal, go to the Book Cafe area, check out our toolkits, let us know what you feel about it, and keep writing, keep visiting, and I hope we can take this conversation ahead. Thank you so much. I hope all of you have a good day ahead.
And a
Thank
big,
you.
big thanks to the chair, Anjali Bhatia, without whom this conversation would not have moved.
Definitely,
A big,
definitely.
big thank you. We should ask her to discuss her book next.
Yes, yes. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Anjali, ma'am, because without her, this entire conversation would not have would have panned out in the way it did. Thank you.
Thank you, WISCOMP. You're the reason. Thank you. Best wishes, Akash Lina.
Thank you all.